Hey everyone, welcome back to Sleep into Power. I'm NJ, and tonight, I want to begin with a curious thought. Almost no one notices the day people stop interrupting them. It happens quietly, and it can happen to perfectly ordinary people. So imagine, for a moment, that it has happened to you. Imagine stepping into a room where the conversation is already in motion. Nothing dramatic occurs, but a sentence pauses somewhere near the middle. Heads turn a fraction earlier than they used to. A path opens across the floor that no one decided to open, and a chair appears that was already occupied a second ago. You say something mildly amusing, and the laughter arrives a little too readily, as though the room had agreed in advance that you would be worth laughing with. You mention a preference, casually, almost in passing, and by the end of the evening, the plans have quietly rearranged themselves around it. Someone glances at your face before deciding what their own opinion is going to be. And somewhere in all of this, without any announcement, disagreement becomes rare. No one arranged this. If you ask them, they would sincerely deny it. And yet the room has shaped itself around you the way iron filings shape themselves around a magnet held beneath the paper, invisibly, obediently, and without a single person being touched. Tonight, we are not interested in the room. We are interested in the person standing in the doorway. What happens inside a human mind when the world begins to move according to its wishes? Because something does happen, something observable, and stranger than the old warnings suggest. Power appears to change how confidently a person acts, how much risk feels like risk, how quickly the internal question, "Am I allowed to do this?" arrives, and whether it arrives at all. It seems to alter what a mind finds worth attending to, how accurately it reads a face, how a decision feels when its consequences will be experienced by somebody else entirely, and how a person explains their own conduct to themselves afterwards. And the oldest thing we say about it may be the least accurate. Power does not simply corrupt, it liberates, it magnifies, it isolates, distorts, and, perhaps most unsettling of all, it reveals. Because the deepest change may not be in what a person becomes able to do, it may be in what they are no longer required to notice. If tonight's exploration stays with you, you may wish to continue with my book, Sleep into Power, the nightly guide to reprogramming your mind for wealth, success, and inner peace. It explores how sleep, identity, imagination, and the deeper layers of the mind quietly shape the person you are becoming. Drawing together psychology, neuroscience, philosophy, and timeless wisdom, it also offers simple practices you can use during those important final moments before sleep. You'll find Sleep into Power on Amazon in paperback and Kindle. If you'd rather listen with your eyes already closed and your phone face down, Sleep into Power is on Spotify, where these long explorations live away from the screen. And if the channel has given you good nights, there's a Buy Me a Coffee page, no obligation at all, only an open door for those who'd like these journeys to keep being made. There's also a companion channel, Meditate into Power, for when you want practice rather than a story, guided meditations for relaxation, confidence, inner change, and personal power. Sleep into Power is where we wander through psychology, philosophy, consciousness, and human behavior at length. Meditate into Power is where you sit down and do the work gently. Every link is waiting in the description whenever you want it. So as the room around you grows quieter, and the world outside asks nothing further of you tonight, let us step into the hidden psychology of power and discover what begins to change inside a human being who no longer expects to hear the word no. To understand what power does to a mind, we have to begin with a mind that does not have very much of it. And that means beginning with something so ordinary that it is almost invisible. You spend an enormous amount of your life predicting other people, not consciously, not as a deliberate activity, but underneath the surface of an ordinary day, a vast and continuous computation is running, and most of what it is computing is what other human beings are likely to think, feel, want, and do. You can watch it happening if you slow down and look. You write a message and then read your own words back before you send them, and notice what you are actually doing there. You are not checking the spelling. You are hearing the sentence in somebody else's voice, in somebody else's mood, on a day you cannot see. You are running a simulation of another mind and adjusting yourself according to its output. You walk into an unfamiliar building and your posture changes very slightly. You decide not to say the funnier version of the thing you were going to say, because there is one person present who might take it the wrong way. You notice that a friend's reply was 3 words shorter than usual, and something in your chest tightens, and for the next hour, a small background process runs beneath your thoughts, quietly asking whether everything is all right between you. None of this feels like effort. That is the remarkable part. It runs the way breathing runs, beneath awareness, continuously, and at a cost you almost never notice paying. There is a very old reason for it. For most of the time human beings have existed, being disliked was not simply uncomfortable, it was dangerous. A person alone on the ancestral landscape did not last long. Food, warmth, shelter, protection, the sharing of risk, the raising of children, all of it depended on being tolerated, and then valued, by a small number of people who had known you your whole life and could not easily be replaced. Exclusion was not a social wound, it was a physical threat. So we became exquisitely sensitive to the signals of belonging, the half-smile that does not reach the eyes, the pause before agreement, the tone that says yes and means not really. Human beings detect these things at astonishing speed, often faster than we can explain what we have detected. And this sensitivity is not a personality trait or a moral achievement. It is closer to being a survival organ. And alongside that sensitivity, something else runs continuously, and it is worth naming, because most people would deny doing it. You rank, not deliberately, not unkindly, but within moments of entering almost any group of human beings, some part of your mind has produced a rough map of who matters here, who defers to whom, whose approval is worth having, and roughly where you sit on that map yourself. You could not explain how you did it. You do it in rooms full of strangers, in the first minute of a meeting, in a group of friends who would all insist that they have no hierarchy at all. We are, in this respect, thoroughly ordinary primates. Every social species that lives in stable groups develops structures of rank, because rank is what allows a group to make decisions without fighting about every one of them. Hierarchy is not a corruption of social life. It is one of the ways social life becomes possible. But we are unusual in one respect, and it matters tonight. Our hierarchies are not fixed by size or strength. They are made of opinion, which means position must be maintained continuously, in the minds of others, through behavior, and that a person's standing can change entirely without a single physical event occurring. Which is why exclusion hurts the way it does. When researchers have looked at what happens in the brain during social rejection, being left out of a simple game, for instance, they have found activity in regions also involved in the distressing dimension of physical pain. This finding has been much repeated and much argued over, and I want to be honest about the argument. Those regions are involved in many kinds of salient, unpleasant experience, and reading backwards from brain activity to a specific feeling is exactly the kind of inference we should be careful with. But the broader point does not depend on the scan. You already know that being excluded hurts. You know it in a way that requires no evidence, because you have felt it, in a corridor at school, or in a group message you were not added to, or in the particular quiet of a room where you have understood, without being told, that you are not really wanted. That hurt is not weakness. It is the alarm of a creature that evolved knowing exclusion could kill it. And power, more than anything else, is the state of no longer hearing that alarm. Now, when researchers look at what the brain is doing during this kind of thinking, during the ordinary act of considering another person's mind, they find that it is not one small area lighting up like a switch. It is a set of regions that tend to become active together, spread across the brain, particularly towards the middle of the frontal lobes and at the junction where the temporal and parietal lobes meet, above and behind the ear. This network is often engaged when people think about beliefs, intentions, and the inner lives of others. I want to be careful with a sentence like that, because this is exactly the point where popular accounts of neuroscience begin to go wrong. Knowing that certain regions are recruited when you think about somebody else's mind does not mean we have located empathy. It does not mean there is a place where understanding other people lives, which could be strengthened or damaged like a muscle. Brains do not work in that tidy municipal way, with departments and addresses. What we have is a pattern of involvement, a suggestion that this kind of thinking is effortful, distributed, and reliably taxing. And that last word is the one that matters tonight. Taxing. Because thinking about other minds costs something. It competes with everything else the mind is trying to do. When you are tired or rushed or frightened or holding too many things at once, your accuracy about other people declines. Not because you have become a worse person, but because you have run short of the resources that accuracy requires. You have felt this, everyone has. The evening when you snapped at somebody you love and could not, in the moment, feel what it landed like, and then felt it entirely and terribly an hour later when the pressure had gone. Nothing about your character changed in that hour. What changed was what you had available. So hold two ideas side by side, because everything we discuss tonight will grow out of the space between them. Understanding other people is expensive, and minds spend expensive resources only where they must. Now look at who spends the most. Watch a child in a household where one parent's mood is unpredictable. That child becomes a reader of footsteps. They learn the difference between keys placed on a table and keys dropped on a table. They can tell from the first syllable of a greeting what kind of evening this is going to be, and they arrange themselves accordingly. Brighter, quieter, absent, useful, before a single word has been addressed to them. That child has not been gifted with unusual sensitivity. They have been trained by necessity. When you cannot control the weather, you learn to read the sky. Watch a new employee in their first fortnight. They study everything. They learn who is actually listened to in meetings, which is rarely the same as who speaks most. They work out which requests are genuine and which are formalities, whose approval is decorative and whose is decisive. They can tell you, with startling precision, the emotional topography of a place they entered 2 weeks ago, because they have no power, and when you have no power, attention becomes your only instrument. Watch anyone who is in love and not yet certain it is returned. The mind becomes a forensic laboratory. Every message is examined for evidence. Every silence is interpreted, and then reinterpreted, and then defended against the interpretation. This is not weakness or foolishness. It is the ordinary human response to depending upon someone whose feelings you cannot command. Hold on to that phrase. We will return to it several times tonight, in several different lights. Whose feelings you cannot command. That is the ordinary human condition. That is the water almost all of us swim in, for almost all of our lives. Your careful attention to other people is the tax you pay for needing them. And there is a further cost, less obvious and more corrosive, which is what all this vigilance does to the rest of thinking. Researchers studying people under severe financial pressure have found something that ought to be better known. When a mind is preoccupied, when part of it is permanently occupied with an unresolved problem, running the same anxious calculations in the background, less of it is available for everything else. Attention narrows, planning suffers, decisions get worse. And this happens to the same person, measurably, when their circumstances change and their preoccupation lifts. Which means that some of what looks like poor judgment in people with very little power may not be a property of those people at all. It may be a property of what their minds are being forced to carry. That is worth sitting with for a moment, because it inverts something we usually believe. We tend to assume that people end up with little power because they think badly. It may be at least as true that they think badly because they have little power. And if that is so, then the reverse ought to be true as well. If powerlessness occupies the mind, then power should free it, and it does. That is the beginning of the story. Not corruption, not cruelty. Something far more seductive, and far harder to see as it happens. Relief. Because here is the quiet, unsettling foundation beneath everything we are going to explore tonight. You are not naturally attentive to other people. You are attentive because you have to be. And power, more than anything else, is a change in what you have to do. So let us follow the person who acquires it. It almost never arrives as a coronation. That is one of the reasons it is so difficult to notice from the inside. Hardly anybody is handed a crown, and the ones who are tend to be prepared for it. What actually happens to most people is smaller, stranger, and distributed across 100 unremarkable moments. You are promoted, and on a Tuesday, you mention in a meeting that you are not sure the timeline works. By Thursday, the timeline has changed. Nobody argued, nobody negotiated, there was no campaign. A thought that lived only inside your head on Tuesday has become a fact in the world by Thursday. And the distance between those two things, which for your entire life has been enormous, full of persuasion and patience and compromise and waiting, has quietly collapsed to almost nothing. Or money arrives, and you notice the question changing shape. It stops being "can I?" and becomes "do I want to?" That is a shorter sentence, and it removes an entire category of resistance from a life. A friend cancels dinner, and you do not spend the evening wondering what it meant, because there were 4 other things you could have done instead. Or a following gathers. You post a thought you had while brushing your teeth, and by lunchtime several thousand people have told you it changed the way they see something. Some part of you registers that your ordinary thoughts are no longer ordinary. They are received, or you simply become the person who allocates something, shifts, budgets, time, approval, attention. It does not have to be much. It only has to be something other people want and cannot easily get elsewhere. And the way it arrives changes a great deal about what it does to a person, which is something the old warnings tend to flatten. Power that is inherited arrives before the person does. It was never earned, and so it can never be lost through failure, only through catastrophe. People raised inside it often carry a curious ease because they have never had to imagine life without it, and the absence of that imagination is itself a kind of blindness. They may be perfectly kind, but they will find it very difficult to understand why anybody would be frightened of them, because they have no memory of standing on the other side. Power that is earned slowly is the gentlest form, and probably the safest, because the person arrives with their old self still attached. They remember the first job. They know the names of people who do the work, because they used to do it. The change is gradual enough that their relationships can adapt without breaking, and gradual change is the only kind most relationships survive. Power that is seized carries a permanent shadow. Whoever took it knows, better than anyone, that it can be taken, because they proved it. And that knowledge does not fade with time. It sits underneath everything, quietly suggesting that the room is full of people doing exactly what you once did. Power that is granted by others, voted for, appointed, chosen, has a strange double edge. It comes with a story about service, which is protective, because the story is difficult to abandon without noticing. But it also comes with the constant awareness that what was given can be withdrawn, and that awareness can quietly become the thing that drives every decision, until the preservation of the position begins to masquerade as the pursuit of the purpose. And there is power that arrives by accident, the thing that spread, the moment that was captured. This may be the strangest form of all, because the person's sense of themselves has not had time to change with their circumstances, and so they walk around inside a life that does not fit, recognized by people they have never met, treated as significant by strangers, and privately aware that nothing about them has actually altered since the week before. Each of these produces a slightly different mind, but they share one thing, and it is the thing we are following tonight. In every case, the world has begun to yield, and what happens in the mind at this point is, I think, one of the most underrated experiences available to a human being. We talk about power as though its central pleasure were domination. For most people, most of the time, it is nothing of the kind. The central pleasure is much quieter, and much more ordinary, and much more difficult to give up. It is the disappearance of friction. Consider how much of your inner life is friction. The rehearsal before a difficult conversation, performed 3 times in the shower. The apologetic scaffolding around a simple request. Sorry, would you mind? Only if you have time. Absolutely no rush. The anticipation of refusal. The management of other people's possible disappointment. The endless small negotiations required to move even slightly through a world that does not particularly care what you want. And then, one day, some of that is simply gone. You say the thing plainly. You ask without the cushioning. You make a decision, and it becomes, without further ceremony, what is happening. There is a lightness to this that is genuinely difficult to describe to anyone who has not felt it. And it is not the lightness of cruelty. It is closer to the sensation of a limp disappearing. You did not fully realize how much you had been compensating until you stopped needing to. And there is a second relief hidden inside the first, which almost nobody names, and which may be the more addictive of the two. Waiting stops. Think about how much of a life without power is spent waiting. Waiting for a reply. Waiting for a decision to be made somewhere above you, by people whose reasoning you will never be told. Waiting for the appointment, the approval, the callback, the outcome. Waiting in the ordinary sense, in queues and rooms with bad chairs, but also waiting in the deeper sense, in which large parts of your future are held by other people, and there is nothing to do but continue existing until they get to it. Waiting is not merely inconvenient. It is a statement about whose time is considered valuable. Everyone understands this instinctively, which is why being kept waiting can feel like an insult, even when no insult was intended. And power ends it. Not completely, but noticeably. Things happen when you want them to happen. Your questions get answered the same day. Your time becomes the fixed point around which other people's time arranges itself. And once that has been true for a while, it stops registering as a privilege at all. It simply becomes how time works, which is why the sensation of being made to wait can become so disproportionately intolerable to people who have not experienced it in years. It is not really the delay that stings. It is the information the delay contains. People at this stage of power very often describe it as feeling like becoming more themselves. That phrase deserves to be held up to the light, because it is honest, and because it is only half true, and because understanding why it is only half true will take us most of the night. For now, let it stand. There is something genuinely good happening here, and it deserves to be said clearly before we complicate it. A person who has spent 15 years being talked over discovers that when they speak, the room waits. A person who has swallowed 100 good ideas discovers that ideas can now become real things that other people use. A person who spent a childhood at the mercy of somebody else's mood discovers a room where the mood is theirs to set, and, if they are decent, uses that to make it a gentle one. We should not pretend this is not a relief. For many people, it is the greatest relief of their adult life. The trouble is not the relief. The trouble is what the relief begins to do to attention. Because something shifts in the orientation of the mind, and it is worth describing carefully. because this is the part that most often gets mangled into slogans. Psychologists studying power have proposed that it tends to shift the balance between two broad tendencies that exist in all of us. One is the pull towards reward, the system that orients you towards what could be gained, that makes opportunity vivid, that produces eagerness, appetite, and forward motion. The other is the pull towards caution, the system that scans for punishment, cost, disapproval, and threat, that produces hesitation, and that quietly runs the question, what could go wrong here, underneath your plans? Every human being has both. What varies is which one is louder and when. The proposal, and I want to call it a proposal because it is a framework for making sense of many findings rather than a fact carved into bone, is that having power tends to turn the first one up and the second one down. Let me describe what that feels like, rather than what it is called. Imagine two people looking at exactly the same opportunity, the same proposal, the same offer, the same open door. The first person, who has little power, sees the door and instantly sees everything surrounding the door. The cost of walking through. What happens if it closes behind them? Who might be irritated? Whether they are really qualified. What happened to the last person who tried this? Their attention spreads outward from the opportunity into a fine web of consequences, and most of that web is made of other people's possible reactions. The second person, who has power, sees the door. That is not stupidity. It is a real difference in what becomes vivid. Attention narrows and brightens onto the goal, and the surrounding cloud of caveats grows fainter. Not absent, fainter, less loud in the mind, easier to step past. Now, what is happening physically while that occurs is genuinely interesting and genuinely easy to overstate, so let us go slowly. The brain has systems deeply involved in motivation and the pursuit of reward, running through structures near the base and center of the brain, and richly connected to the frontal regions involved in planning and control. Dopamine is central to how these systems work, though not in the way popular writing suggests. It is not a pleasure chemical, and the mind does not fill up with it like a glass. Its role has more to do with wanting than with liking, with anticipation, with learning which actions are worth repeating, with the difference between what you expected and what you got. There is reasonable evidence that circumstances involving status, control, and success engage these motivational systems. There is reasonable evidence that they influence how strongly a possible gain pulls at us. There is no evidence whatsoever for a power center in the brain. I want to say that plainly, because it is the single most common distortion in this subject. There is no seat of dominance, no region that swells when you are promoted. What exists is a set of general-purpose systems for motivation, control, threat, and social understanding, which have been shaped by everything in your history, which behave differently depending on your personality and your culture and your circumstances, and which respond to changes in your situation, of which power is one. Neuroscience does not explain power. At its best, it describes some of the machinery through which a change in your situation becomes a change in your experience. And the change in experience is this. The world begins to look full of open doors, and the door frames become harder to see, which has a consequence we do not discuss honestly enough, because it is inconvenient for our moral instincts. It works. Whatever else power does, this particular shift frequently makes people more effective. They act sooner, they speak more directly, they tolerate uncertainty that would paralyze somebody else. They make a decision in 1 week that a more careful person would still be researching next spring. They take a risk that turns out well, and everybody concludes afterwards that they possess exceptional judgment, when what they actually possessed was less inhibition. A great deal of the world's courage comes from this. So does a great deal of its creativity. It is very hard to make something strange and new while the anticipated disapproval of others is playing loudly in the background, and power turns that volume down. The bold decision, the honest sentence spoken in a room full of careful evasion, the refusal to accept that a thing must be done the way it has always been done. These are frequently gifts of the same mechanism. But notice what else has been dimmed. Because the internal voice that says, "This might be a mistake," travels along the same channel as the voice that says, "They might be hurt by this." Turn one down, and you tend to turn down the other. In the architecture of the mind, they are not neatly separated into different rooms. They are both forms of imagining a future in which something bad happens to somebody. Anticipating your own failure and anticipating another person's pain are, mechanically, closer relatives than we like to think. So the powerful person is usually not deciding to ignore the consequences to others. Those consequences have simply grown quieter, along with everything else that once stood between intention and action, which is why the same shift produces both the decisive leader and the reckless one. The same shift produces the person who finally says the necessary thing, and the person who says the unnecessary and wounding thing without noticing the room turn cold. The same shift that lets one person take the great risk, lets another take the foolish one. And from the inside, this is the part I most want you to hear. From the inside, in the moment of acting, these feel identical. They both feel like clarity. That is what makes it so difficult to catch. The subjective experience of reduced inhibition is not the experience of being reckless. Nobody feels reckless. It feels like finally seeing straight. It feels like having cut through a fog that everyone else is still standing in. It feels like being the only person in the room, willing to say what is obvious. And sometimes, it is clarity. That is the maddening part, and the reason this cannot be reduced to a warning. Sometimes the powerful person is genuinely right, and the hesitation surrounding them was genuinely fear wearing the costume of prudence. Power does not always distort. Sometimes it liberates a perception that was accurate all along and merely unspeakable. But from inside a single human mind, on a single ordinary afternoon, the two conditions produce exactly the same warm certainty, which means something has been lost that was never valued while it was there. Before, when you were uncertain, the uncertainty told you something. It was information. It was a signal generated by a system quietly modeling the consequences of your actions, including the consequences to other people, and delivering its results as a feeling. Now the absence of uncertainty tells you almost nothing, because the machinery that used to generate it has been turned down. Let that settle. There is no hurry tonight. The first thing power takes is not your goodness. It is your doubt. And doubt, for all its discomfort, was doing far more work than anybody realized. There is a small experiment I find myself returning to, and I want to describe it carefully, because it is easy to make it carry more weight than it can bear. People are asked to draw a letter on their own forehead with a finger. That is the whole task. But there is a hidden fork inside it, because you can draw the letter so that it reads correctly to yourself, from the inside, or so that it reads correctly to the person sitting opposite you. In studies of this kind, people who have been made to feel powerful, sometimes only briefly, sometimes only by being asked to recall a time when they had authority over someone, have been found more likely to draw it the first way, legible to themselves, backwards to everyone else. Now, this is one small effect from one narrow task, and psychology has learned in the last decade to be humble about small effects from narrow tasks. Some famous findings in this field have not held up when tested again. A widely reported claim that adopting expansive postures changes your hormones and your risk-taking has been substantially undermined by later work, and honest researchers have said so publicly. So I do not offer the forehead study as proof of anything. I offer it as an image, because as an image it is almost unbearably apt, and because you can watch the same shape playing out in real rooms. which is a better test than any laboratory. Watch the senior person explaining a plan clearly to themselves, and watch them fail to understand why everyone else appears confused. Watch the instruction that made complete sense in the room where it was written, and arrives as nonsense in the place where it must be carried out. Watch the message that was perfectly obvious in the mind that composed it, and lands as coldness in the mind that receives it, legible from the inside, backwards to everyone else. Which brings us to the part of this subject that people find most uncomfortable, and which is very easy to say badly. You will sometimes hear it claimed that power destroys empathy, that the powerful simply stop caring, as though something had been surgically removed. I do not think that is what happens, and I think the truer version is more interesting, and considerably more troubling. Empathy is not only a feeling. A large part of it is a skill, an active, effortful reading of another person's face, tone, posture, history and situation, performed continuously and mostly beneath awareness. And like every skill, it responds to how often it is practiced, and how much depends on practicing it well. So ask a simple question about the person who has just gained authority. What, exactly, are they now required to notice? When you needed something from a person, you studied them. You learned the difference between their real yes and their polite yes. You knew without being told which morning was the wrong morning to ask. You had constructed, over months, an extraordinarily detailed working model of another human being. And you built it because you had to, because your outcomes lived inside their moods. And now you do not need to ask. You decide. Nothing has been taken from you. No capacity has been damaged. It is simply that a very expensive process has stopped being necessary, and the mind is relentlessly economical about processes that have stopped being necessary. Attention drains away from what no longer changes the outcome, the way a path through a field disappears when people stop walking it. When researchers have looked at this directly, they have found something consistent with that account. People placed in higher power positions, or primed to feel powerful, tend to perform slightly less well at judging what others are feeling, reading expressions, inferring intentions, taking another person's visual or emotional viewpoint. I want to be careful again. These are mostly modest laboratory effects. The honest description is a tendency, not a law. There are powerful people who read others with great precision, and there always have been. Indeed, some acquired power precisely because they could, but the pattern appears often enough to take seriously. And what it suggests is not that the powerful become incapable of understanding others. It is that they become less practiced and less motivated to bother. There is one further finding worth mentioning, with the same caution. When people watch another person perform a simple action, a hand squeezing a ball, regions of the observer's own motor system tend to become gently active, as though quietly rehearsing the movement. It is one of the small automatic ways that bodies resonate with other bodies. Some research has found this resonance to be weaker in people who have been primed with high power. If that holds, it is a striking thing, not a change in what someone believes about others, but a change in how much their nervous system quietly echoes them. But I would rather you held that lightly than tightly. It is a thin thread of evidence, and thin threads should not carry heavy conclusions. The behavior is easier to observe than the mechanism, and the behavior is clear enough on its own. Because meanwhile, at the other end of the same hierarchy, something is happening in precisely the opposite direction. The people with the least power are becoming extraordinary readers of the people with the most. They know exactly how long to wait after a difficult meeting before asking for something. They know that when the director says interesting, it means no, and that when the director says let me think about it, it also means no, but a different kind of no, the kind that can be revisited in 3 weeks, if the conditions are right. They know which sentence in the email is the real sentence, and which paragraph is decoration. They hold detailed, accurate working knowledge of a person who could not, if pressed, describe them accurately at all. This asymmetry is one of the quiet engines of the world, and it explains an enormous amount of ordinary human friction. Two people leave the same conversation. One of them has been analyzing it in fine detail and will continue analyzing it for hours, replaying particular phrases, testing possible meanings. The other has already forgotten most of it, and would be genuinely astonished to learn that anything in it had been significant. Neither is lying about their experience. They were simply in different rooms, in the same room. And this is where a piece of neuroscience becomes useful, if we use it carefully. The kind of thinking that lets you hold another person's perspective while it conflicts with your own is not automatic. It draws on the same limited capacities that let you hold two possibilities in mind at once, override a first impulse, keep a goal steady while working around an obstacle. These abilities are supported by networks running through the frontal regions of the brain, and their connections deeper in, but again, not as a single seat of control. As a widely distributed set of processes that are effortful, that vary between people, and that degrade reliably when a mind is tired, stressed, or overloaded. That matters here, for a simple reason. Taking someone else's perspective is work, and it is precisely the kind of work that gets skipped when it is not required. The powerful person has less requirement. The powerless person has nothing but requirement. And here is the observation that turns this from an interesting finding into something with real weight. The powerful person is not simply less accurate about other people. They usually do not know they have become less accurate. Nothing announces the loss. There is no moment of realizing that your model of other minds has grown thin, because the people around you have quietly stopped correcting it, and they have stopped correcting it precisely because you have power, which means the errors become invisible at exactly the moment they begin to matter most. Let your breathing slow a little here. None of this is a verdict on anyone. It is a description of a mechanism, and mechanisms do not care about our character. That is rather the point. There is a further step in this, and it goes deeper than misreading a face. Because as power increases, it does not only place a person further from other people's feelings, it places them further from events themselves. Think about the physical shape of authority. It almost always involves distance. The decision is made in a different building from the place where it lands. The person who signs is not the person who delivers, who is not the person who receives. Information arrives already processed, summarized, aggregated, cleaned, arranged into columns. Human beings arrive as figures, categories, projections, segments, percentages, and something happens in the mind when a consequence is represented rather than witnessed. Psychologists have described a fairly robust pattern. The further away something is from us, in time, in space, in social connection, in likelihood, the more abstractly we tend to think about it. Distant things are represented in terms of their general meaning and purpose. Near things are represented in terms of their concrete detail, their texture, their difficulty, their feel. This is genuinely useful. It is how planning is possible at all. But it means that the same event can be two entirely different objects in the mind, depending on where you are standing in relation to it. Consider two versions of an identical decision. In the first, you must sit across a desk from a man in his 50s, whose daughter's photograph is beside his keyboard, and tell him that after 19 years, there is no longer a role for him here. You will watch his face rearrange itself. You will hear him say "right" and then "right" again, because he cannot find another word. You will notice that he thanks you on his way out, which is somehow the worst part, and you will feel the temperature of that room in your body for a long time afterwards. In the second, you approve a headcount reduction of 4% in the Northern Division. The number of people whose lives change is the same. The moral weight, if we are honest, is the same. But the two experiences are not remotely alike, and they are not alike because the human mind was built for the first kind of situation and has no adequate response to the second. We evolved to feel the suffering we can see. We have no organ for feeling a spreadsheet. This is not a special flaw of the powerful. It is universal. You have felt it yourself in a smaller register. The way one lost dog on a poster can move you more than a statistic representing thousands of people. That is not hypocrisy. That is simply the shape of the equipment we were issued. But power places a person on the far side of that gap almost permanently. And once you are there, something insidious happens to language, because abstraction requires vocabulary, and vocabulary makes further abstraction easier. People become resources, and resources are allocated. They become stakeholders, and stakeholders are managed. They become headcount, the base, the market, the opposition, collateral, assets, the affected population. Each of these words is useful. Each was probably coined innocently, by someone genuinely trying to think clearly about complexity. And each performs a small anesthetic operation on the part of the mind that would otherwise picture a face. Now, I want to be fair to distance, because we usually are not. Distance is not only how cruelty happens, it is also how large-scale good happens. A surgeon who felt the full human reality of the person beneath their hands, moment by moment, could not operate. A judge overwhelmed by sympathy for whoever spoke most movingly would produce something other than justice. A person distributing aid to 100,000 people cannot spend an hour with each of them, and must therefore think in categories, and the categories are what allow the 100,000 to be helped at all. Abstraction is what lets a mind built for a village act meaningfully at the scale of a nation. So distance is not the villain of this story. Distance is a tool, and like every tool, it does not know what it is being used for. The danger is not that powerful people think in numbers. The danger is that they can lose the ability to convert the numbers back. And that reverse translation, from figure to face, from policy to person, from percentage to the particular man with the photograph beside his keyboard, is not automatic. It has to be chosen. It requires time and effort, and often deliberate inconvenience. And nothing in the structure of power will ever require it of you, which is why the people who keep it are so noticeable, and why the ones who lose it so rarely notice that it has gone. There is one form of power that deserves a moment of its own, because it does something the others do not, and because more people live inside it now than at any previous point in human history. Being known by people you do not know. Fame is a peculiar substance. It is power without authority, the ability to influence enormous numbers of people combined, quite often, with very little ability to influence anything specific at all. And it produces an experience the human mind has no equipment for, because for almost the entire span of our existence, everybody who recognized your face was someone you also recognized. Now imagine the arithmetic reversed. Thousands of people hold a version of you in their minds. They have opinions about your character. They feel warmly towards you, or coldly, and their feelings are entirely sincere. And you cannot hold any of them in return, because there are too many, and because you have never met them. Every relationship becomes one-directional at scale. What that does, over time, is strange. Affection arrives constantly, in volume, from people who do not know you, which sounds wonderful, and is, for a while. But affection from strangers cannot correct you. It responds to a version of you that has been assembled from fragments. It cannot say you were unkind on Tuesday, because it was not there on Tuesday. So a person can be surrounded by love and receive no feedback whatsoever. And criticism arrives in the same undiscriminating volume, from people who also do not know you, which teaches a lesson that is very difficult to unlearn, that criticism is noise, weather, something to be endured rather than considered. And once criticism has been classified as noise, the genuine, careful, private criticism from the person who does know you can end up filed in the same place. That may be the quiet danger of this particular kind of power. Not the attention. The way that attention at scale can gradually destroy a person's ability to tell signal from noise, until the only voices that still land are the ones that agree. And now we arrive at the center of it. Everything else tonight orbits around this. There is a sentence that runs quietly beneath ordinary human life, and most of us have heard it so continuously that we no longer register it as a sentence at all. It arrives before the sharp remark, before the second helping, before the thing you almost said in the meeting and did not. It is very short. Am I allowed to do this? Sometimes it is fear of punishment. Sometimes it is fear of being seen. Sometimes it is genuine conscience, which is a different thing living in a different place, though from the inside they can be almost impossible to tell apart. But whatever its source, that sentence functions as a gate. And most people spend an entire life passing through gates they never consciously examine, obeying rules they could not state if you asked them. Power opens the gates, not all at once, not dramatically, steadily, one at a time, as a person discovers that consequences which used to follow certain actions no longer follow them. And here is what people misunderstand about this. It is the thing I most want you to carry into sleep tonight. Power does not usually put anything new inside a person. It lets out what was already there. I think we resist this idea because the alternative is more comfortable. If power creates cruelty, then cruelty is an accident that happens to people, an external contamination, and the rest of us are safe from it. But if power merely releases, then whatever emerges was already in residence, living quietly, restrained not by virtue but by circumstance, waiting for the gate to open. And you cannot know what is behind your own gates. That is the uncomfortable part. You have never seen it, because it has never been let out. So consider what happens when the gate opens on different kinds of people. This is where a single force produces entirely different worlds. Take someone genuinely kind, who has spent a life wanting to help and being unable to at any meaningful scale. Give them authority. What is released is not restraint but generosity. They discover they can protect people. They can make the decision they always wished someone would make for them, back when they were the one being decided about. Their kindness, which was previously a private quality expressed in small gestures, becomes structural. It changes how 100 people are treated on 100 ordinary Tuesdays. And this happens constantly and quietly and receives almost no attention, because the absence of harm makes no sound. We have no word for the disaster that did not occur, because someone decent was in the chair. Take someone who has spent years feeling humiliated, who has swallowed a great deal, who carries the memory of being small in rooms where other people were large. Give them authority, and one of two things tends to be released. It may be an intense and lifelong determination that nobody under their care will ever feel what they felt. Some of the finest people in any organization are built exactly this way, and their protectiveness has a specificity to it. They notice the person being talked over because they were that person. Or it may be something else entirely. It may be the discovery that the humiliation can now be handed onwards, that there is finally somewhere for it to go, and that having somewhere for it to go feels, and this is the terrible part, it feels like justice. It feels like the world being corrected. Take someone with real appetite, for pleasure, for admiration, for accumulation. They have always had it, most people do in some measure. What changed is not the appetite, but the fact that the world has stopped saying no. And appetite that is never refused does not stay the same size. It grows towards the space available to it, the way a root grows towards water. And take someone who is simply frightened of being found out, of being replaced, of not being enough, and of everyone eventually noticing. Power does not cure that. Power gives fear an instrument. This is why the old phrase is not quite right. Power tends to corrupt, we say. as though the process ran in one direction only, as though we were all standing at the same starting line waiting to be pushed the same way. Amplification is a better word, but amplification on its own is still too gentle, because it suggests that power merely makes people more of what they were and leaves everything else intact. And it does something further while it is amplifying. It removes the conditions that used to keep a person accurate. It thins the information arriving. It reduces the corrections. It quietens the doubt, as we have seen. And it thins the practice of understanding others, as we have seen. So it is not simply that power reveals character. It is that power reveals character while degrading the instruments a person would need in order to see themselves clearly. That is the actual danger. Not the emergence of the hidden self, but the emergence of the hidden self into a room with no mirrors. Let us look, gently, at some of the shapes this takes. Not as diagnoses. Nobody is a type, and the moment we start sorting human beings into categories, we stop seeing them. Think of these instead as weather systems, patterns that can pass through any of us, on any given year, and that power holds in place for far longer than they would otherwise stay. There is the person who cannot tolerate uncertainty about loyalty. They are often warm, sometimes extraordinarily so, but they need to know, so they test. They notice who came to the thing and who did not. They ask questions that are not really questions, and remember the answers for years. And the tragedy built into this pattern is arithmetical. Loyalty, once demanded, can no longer be verified, because the demand guarantees the performance. So they receive endless assurance and are never once reassured, and every unsatisfying assurance makes the next demand slightly larger. There is the person for whom admiration functions as evidence, not as pleasure, as proof. Every deferential room confirms something they suspect about themselves and cannot confirm alone. This is why such people can be exhausting to be near, without ever being obviously unkind. They are not trying to dominate you. They are trying, continuously, to establish a fact about themselves using instruments that can never settle the question. And because that kind of proof decays, because yesterday's admiration does not count towards today, the requirement renews itself every morning for the whole of a life. There is the person who sees threat everywhere. They read a delayed reply as a signal. They notice two colleagues leaving a room together and wonder what about. They are frequently intelligent, and their intelligence supplies excellent reasons for the vigilance. And because power genuinely does attract rivals and genuinely does invite manipulation, they are sometimes right, which is exactly what makes the pattern so difficult to escape. Enough real threats appear to justify treating everything as one. There is the person who has confused control with safety. Somewhere earlier, often much earlier, the world taught them that being at another's mercy was unbearable, and they concluded, quite reasonably at the time, that the answer was never to be there again. So they arrange everything, they tighten, they leave nothing to chance or to trust. And the terrible arithmetic here is that the tightening never produces the feeling it was designed to produce. Because what they actually want is not control. What they want is to feel safe. And safety of that kind is only ever given by trust, which is the one thing that control cannot manufacture. There is the person who uses authority as a shield for other people. They exist, and we should say so clearly, because a night like this can make it sound as though power only ever goes one way. They take the difficult meeting so their team does not have to. They spend their credibility on people who will never know it was spent. They make themselves less comfortable so that someone with less power is more comfortable, and they do it without narrating it, which is what distinguishes it from performance. This is not rare, it is merely quiet. And quiet things are badly underrepresented in our picture of power, because we mostly learn about power from its loudest instances. And there is the person who builds fences around themselves. I find this last one the most interesting of all, because it is the least intuitive. These are people who deliberately construct limits on their own authority, who keep someone in their life whose actual job is to disagree with them, who insist on rules that constrain them personally, who arrange to be inconvenienced by the reality of their own decisions, who put things beyond their own reach in advance, because they do not entirely trust their future self. That phrase is worth repeating slowly. They do not entirely trust their future self. That is not weakness. It may be the single most reliable sign of a person who can hold power for a long time without being reshaped by it. Because they have understood the central problem, that the version of you who will one day be tempted is not the version of you currently making the rule. And the tempted version will have excellent arguments, better arguments in fact, because they will be assembled precisely for the occasion. Now notice something about all 6 of these. Not one was created by power. Every one is an ordinary human pattern. You can find each of them in a family, a friendship, a small office, a group of teenagers deciding who is included this week. Power did not invent the person who needs loyalty or the person who protects others. It only supplied a stage large enough for the pattern to become consequential, and removed most of the forces that would ordinarily have interrupted it. Which raises a question you might carry with you as we go on, without needing to answer it tonight. Which of those weather systems is nearest to your own sky? And now let us talk about what happens to the air around a powerful person, because this may do the most damage of anything we have discussed, and almost none of it is anybody's fault. Imagine you are the one who decides, and imagine somebody brings you news you will not like. Nothing dramatic happens. You do not shout. You simply go slightly still. Your voice becomes a degree cooler than usual. You ask 1 or 2 sharp questions, entirely reasonable ones. The meeting ends normally, and you have forgotten the whole thing by the afternoon. But the person who brought the news has not forgotten. They will remember that stillness for weeks, and the next time they are holding something you will not like, they will perform a very small piece of arithmetic, barely conscious, over in a second, and they will decide to wait until it is more certain, or to phrase it in a way that leaves them somewhere to stand, or to let somebody else raise it. Now multiply that single second by every person who has anything to tell you, and by every week, for several years. Nobody has lied to you. There has been no conspiracy. There is no villain anywhere in this. But the information arriving at your desk has been filtered 1,000 times before it reaches you. Each filtration performed by someone doing something entirely reasonable. And the world you now believe you are living in has been quietly edited for your comfort by people who like you. And something happens to your own words as well, which is harder to notice than the filtering, because it happens on your side of the conversation. Your remarks stop being remarks. You mention, passing someone's desk, that the report might read better the other way round. You mean it as a thought. You are half thinking aloud. You have already forgotten it by the time you reach the stairs. But it is not received as a thought. It is received as a signal. And because you have power, the safest interpretation of any signal is the strongest one. So an evening's work is undone and redone. A team is reorganized around something you would not defend if asked. Somebody stays late, and you never learn that any of this happened, because nobody is going to tell you that your idle observation cost them 4 hours. They will simply present the new version, and you will say lovely, thank you, having no memory of asking. Over time, this produces a peculiar distortion. The powerful person genuinely does not feel forceful. From the inside, they are just talking. They are being casual, approachable, even tentative, and they cannot understand why people describe them as intimidating, because they can feel their own hesitancy and cannot feel their own weight. Everyone else is standing in the weather. You are the weather, which is why the phrase "I was only thinking out loud" is so common in the mouths of senior people, and so useless, because you can be only thinking out loud, and it can still move furniture in rooms you have never entered. Meanwhile, The shape of your relationships is changing too, and this is even harder to see. Your friendships acquire a slight asymmetry, not because your friends are false, but because you now have things they want, and once that is true, neither of you can be entirely certain what is being expressed. The affection may be completely real, most of it is, but it can no longer be tested, and something untestable is difficult to rest upon. The people who used to speak to you plainly gradually stop, sometimes out of self-protection, sometimes out of a kind of respect that feels like kindness and functions like a wall. The ones who never stop tend to be people who knew you before, which is why the old friend who still finds you slightly ridiculous is one of the most valuable possessions a powerful person can have, and one of the first to be lost, because it is so much more pleasant to spend an evening with people who find you impressive. And critics rarely get silenced in the dramatic way we imagine. They mostly just drift out of the room. They stop being invited, or they stop wanting to come, or they say the thing once, watch it land badly, and decide not to say it twice. The room does not become censored, it becomes self-selecting. And then the loop closes, and it closes so smoothly that nobody inside it can hear the click, because agreement now surrounds you. And here is the trap. Your mind does not maintain separate categories for agreement that was freely given and agreement that was structurally inevitable. Consensus feels like consensus. When everyone you speak to holds the same view, that view stops feeling like a view at all. It begins to feel like a description of reality. And this is where a small piece of vocabulary is worth having, because naming the thing makes it easier to catch. Researchers who study group decisions describe a condition in which a cohesive group, under pressure, drifts towards agreement, not because the evidence supports it, but because agreement itself has become the group's purpose. Doubts go unvoiced. Alternatives are examined less carefully than the favored option. Members privately hold reservations they assume nobody else shares, and because nobody says them, everybody's assumption is confirmed. The striking part is what it feels like from inside. It does not feel like conformity. It feels like being part of an unusually capable team that has finally found the right answer. The confidence is genuine. The unity is real. It is simply not evidence of anything, and a powerful person sits at the center of the conditions that produce it. They arrived with a preference. Their preference is known, and every person in the room has quietly weighed the cost of holding it up to the light. So certainty grows. And certainty is never a neutral feeling. It licenses action. If you are sure, then hesitation is weakness, and objection is obstruction, and it becomes entirely reasonable to move faster, to consult less, to route around the people who would only slow this down, which makes honesty around you more dangerous still, which produces more agreement, which produces more certainty, round and round, tightening, each turn perfectly logical from the inside, until a person is standing in the middle of a structure they never intended to build, making decisions about a world they can no longer see, and feeling more confident than they have ever felt in their life. This is why powerful people are so often surprised, not because they are foolish, because they were the last person in the building to be told. And when decisions made in that condition go wrong, as they do, something remarkable happens inside the mind. I want to describe it without contempt, because it is not a special defect of the powerful. It is standard equipment. You have it too. The mind requires that you remain a reasonable person. It will do a very great deal to preserve that. And its preferred method is not lying, which is effortful and unpleasant and difficult to sustain, but something far more elegant, the construction, after the fact, of a story in which what you did makes sense. You did not evade the question. You chose not to escalate an unproductive discussion. You did not take more than your share. You were compensated appropriately for carrying an unusual burden. You did not break the principle. You made a necessary exception in unusual circumstances, which will not recur. Notice that none of these are experienced as excuses while you are producing them. That is the whole trick. The justification does not feel like justification. It feels like context. And power supplies more context than anyone else has access to. Because the burdens are real. This is where it becomes genuinely subtle. The pressures are real. The stakes are real. The impossibility of explaining a whole situation to people who can only see a fragment of it is real. Which means a powerful person always has a supply of true statements available for building a defense. And a defense built entirely from true statements is nearly impossible to dismantle, from outside or from within. There is a second mechanism running alongside it, and it has a name that describes it well: moral licensing. It works like a ledger. Having done something good, the mind quietly grants itself permission for something less good, as though virtue could be banked and then spent. You have felt this in miniature. The exercise that justifies the indulgence, the generous act that makes a subsequent unkindness feel affordable, the difficult week that entitles you to be short with someone who did not cause it. It is such a familiar movement that it barely registers as a thought at all. Now imagine that ledger at scale. Imagine believing, sincerely and perhaps correctly, that you are the person holding something important together, that thousands of livelihoods depend on your judgment, that the work you do genuinely makes things better. Look how much credit is now sitting in that account. Look what could be withdrawn against it. This is how people who are not monsters do enormous harm without ever once encountering, in their own experience, the sensation of being a wrongdoer. Almost nobody thinks I am the villain here. They think, this is regrettable but necessary. They think they would do the same to me. They think the alternative was worse. They think, I will put this right later when there is time. And each of those thoughts may be, in some limited sense, true. That is what makes self-justification so much more dangerous than lying. Lies can be caught, but a story assembled from real materials about a genuinely difficult situation in which you are the person carrying the weight, that story will hold. It will hold for years. It will hold right up until something forces you to see your own conduct from outside. And for many powerful people, no such moment ever arrives. There is one more difficulty to describe, and then we will begin to turn towards softer ground. We imagine power as relief from anxiety, and at the beginning, as we have seen, it often is. But something reverses. Because everything you gain becomes something you can lose, and the mind attends to potential loss far more insistently than to potential gain. This is one of the better established findings in the study of human judgment. Losses loom larger than equivalent gains. Not slightly larger, substantially. So the person with nothing sleeps badly because of what they lack, and the person with a great deal sleeps badly because of what could be taken. The more there is to hold, the more the holding becomes a full-time occupation of the mind. Positions attract people who would like to have them. Success generates rivals, some real, some imagined, and after a while it becomes genuinely difficult to tell which is which, because the powerful person is receiving edited information, and edited information is fertile ground for suspicion. So neutral events begin to acquire meanings. Two colleagues leaving a room together, an invitation that did not arrive, a tone in a message that was almost certainly nothing. Each is a small ambiguity, and ambiguity, when there is a great deal at stake, does not remain ambiguous for very long. Now, here is where the biology becomes genuinely illuminating, and where the popular story is almost exactly backwards. We tend to assume that the people at the top of a hierarchy are the least stressed, and that stress flows downwards. Long-running work with wild primates, decades of it in the field, suggests something more complicated. Rank matters, but so do other things. How stable the hierarchy is, how much the animal can predict what is coming, how much control it has over what happens to it, and whether it has affiliative relationships, grooming, and closeness and company. In stable periods, dominant animals often show lower levels of stress hormones. But when the hierarchy is unsettled, when position is contested and must be constantly defended, that advantage can reverse, and the stress of maintaining a position can exceed the stress of not having one. I offer that as an analogy rather than a proof. Human societies are not troops of baboons, and the differences matter more than the similarities. But the underlying principle appears to be general, and it shows up in human research too. What predicts a body under chronic strain is not simply how much you have. It is how predictable your world is, how much control you have over what happens to you, and whether there is anybody in your life you do not have to manage. Which explains something that would otherwise be puzzling. Why does the person who has secured almost everything so often look so tired? Because the securing does not end. Because unpredictability increases rather than decreases as more people orbit you with their own interests. Because the number of relationships requiring management grows, while the number of relationships requiring nothing at all shrinks towards zero. And what does a stressed nervous system do? It shifts the balance we described earlier. Threat becomes more salient. Ambiguity resolves towards danger rather than away from it. Careful, effortful, perspective-taking thought, expensive at the best of times, becomes harder to sustain, because a system running on alarm does not have the resources for patient interpretation. So watch the pattern that follows, because it appears everywhere, in courts and empires, and in small offices, and sometimes in families. Fearing disloyalty, a person begins to test for it. The testing is experienced by others as distrust. Distrust corrodes the goodwill that was genuinely there. People become guarded, and guardedness looks precisely like what was feared. So control tightens further and further, and each tightening produces more of the very thing it was meant to prevent, until at last the person is genuinely surrounded by people who cannot be trusted, and can point to it as proof that they were right all along. The wall built for protection becomes the thing that generates the siege. It is one of the oldest and saddest patterns in human affairs, and its cruelty lies in the fact that the sufferer's evidence is real. And notice what it does to the inner life, hour by hour. The constant low-grade assessment, the reading of small signs, the scanning of faces for meanings that may not be there, the inability to receive a simple gesture simply. You will recognize that description. It is exactly what we said at the very beginning, about the person at the bottom of a hierarchy, the child listening to footsteps, the new employee learning who matters, the lover uncertain of being loved. The wheel comes round. Powerlessness makes you watch other people closely, because you depend on them. And power, at its far end, can make you watch other people closely, because you fear them. Only somewhere in the middle, held by relationships that do not require managing, does a person get to simply be with other human beings, without calculation. That is worth remembering on any night when you find yourself envying somebody's position. And there is one experience we have not touched at all, which tells us more about power than almost anything else, because it shows us what power was actually doing all along, losing it. It happens to nearly everyone eventually. The role ends, the company is sold, the children grow up and stop needing decisions made for them. The body ages, and the world begins to look past you in rooms where it used to look at you. And what people describe, when they describe this honestly, is rarely about money or status, in the way outsiders assume. It is about the return of friction. Suddenly there is waiting again. Calls are not returned as quickly. Requests need explaining, and then justifying, and then repeating. The path across the room no longer opens, and a person who has not experienced resistance for 15 years finds that they have lost the muscles for it. The way someone who has been carried a long way finds that walking is harder than they remembered. But there is a second thing, and it is the more revealing one. The information changes. People start telling them the truth again, and it is often unwelcome and occasionally devastating, because among the truths now available is what people actually thought of them during the years when nobody could say. Some cannot bear this and spend the rest of their lives attempting to reconstruct the conditions that protected them from it. You can see them in every profession, still holding a small court, still surrounded by whoever will accept the terms, defending a diminished territory with an energy that seems out of all proportion to what is left. And some are quietly, unexpectedly relieved, because it turns out that being agreed with constantly is a lonelier condition than anybody admits while it is happening, and that being spoken to plainly, even critically, is a form of being taken seriously as a real person, which deference never quite manages to be. That is perhaps the strangest finding in all of this, that some people only discover what they lost when they lose the thing that took it. So let us ask the gentler question now, and let it carry us the rest of the way. Why do some people hold power for decades and remain recognizably themselves? Because they do. We simply do not talk about them enough, partly because their story is undramatic, and partly because what protects them is not a shining personal quality we can admire from a distance. Mostly, it is a set of conditions they arranged and then kept. The first is old relationships. Someone who knew you before, whose regard for you was established on other grounds, and who is therefore not a subject of yours. The person who can say you are being ridiculous and mean it warmly. These friendships are hard to keep because they offer none of the pleasant weather that newer relationships offer. They will not tell you that you are remarkable. They remember you failing your driving test, and they are, for exactly that reason, close to irreplaceable. The second is real accountability, not the appearance of it, limits that actually bind, that can be enforced without your permission by people you cannot remove. Any constraint you can dissolve on a bad day is not a constraint, it is a decoration. The third is contact, regular, unmediated contact with the consequences of what you decide. Not the summary, the thing itself, the room where it lands, the person it lands on, in the same air as you, at the same hour. Not because witnessing suffering is virtuous, it is not on its own, but because faces update a mind in a way that numbers cannot. This is the reverse translation we spoke about, and it does not happen unless it is arranged. The fourth is the capacity to be criticized without retaliating. This is rarer than it sounds, and more decisive than almost anything else, because everything else depends on it. One retaliation, however subtle, however deniable, however easily explained afterwards, and the honest voices around you go quiet for years. People are watching how criticism is received far more carefully than they are listening to how it is invited. The fifth is an identity that does not require the position. If who you are simply is what you command, then any threat to what you command becomes an existential threat, and you will defend it in ways you cannot afterwards explain to yourself. But if you are also a parent, a friend, someone who makes things, someone who walks the same route every morning and knows the dogs by name, then losing the position is a loss rather than a death, and you can behave reasonably about a loss. And the sixth is humility, understood properly, not self-deprecation, not the performance of modesty, which is frequently the particular vanity of successful people, simply accuracy, the willingness to hold a true-sized picture of yourself, including the parts that are genuinely formidable and the parts that are not, and to notice that your position tells you almost nothing about your worth as a human being. Now notice what all six of those have in common as you lie there. None of them is a feeling. Every single one is a structure, a relationship maintained, a rule accepted, a habit kept, a meeting that is in the diary, whether or not you want it to be. Good intentions are not protective. Everybody has good intentions. The difficult characters in history had them in abundance. Intentions are the first thing the mechanisms we have described tonight will quietly rewrite, and they will rewrite them so smoothly that you will experience the new version as the original. What survives is what was built. And there is one more, which almost nobody lists, and which belongs here more than anywhere else: rest. Because everything we have described tonight as protective is expensive. Taking another person's perspective is effortful. Holding a criticism without retaliating requires you to override a first impulse. Converting a number back into a face is work. Noticing your own justification while you are producing it is some of the hardest cognitive work a human being ever does. And all of it draws on the same limited capacities, the ones that let you pause before responding, hold two possibilities at once, and resist the answer that arrives first. Those capacities are reliably worse in a tired mind. This is one of the better established findings we have. Sleep loss degrades exactly this kind of control, the ability to inhibit an impulse, to consider an alternative interpretation, to sit inside ambiguity without resolving it prematurely. And there is reasonable evidence that a tired brain becomes more reactive to threat and less able to regulate that reaction, that the alarm rings more easily, and the part of the mind that would ordinarily talk it down is slower to arrive. Which means something worth carrying into tonight. A great many of the failures we have discussed do not require a flaw of character. They only require exhaustion, the unnecessary sharp remark, the decision made because the meeting was long, and a decision would end it. The suspicion entertained at 11 at night that would have been dismissed at 10 in the morning. The retaliation that seemed proportionate while tired and looks appalling by daylight. Nobody guards well when they have not slept, and people with power are, very often, people who have not slept, because the responsibility follows them home, and the mind keeps working on it in the dark. So the least glamorous protection of all may also be the most practical. A person who is rested is more likely to notice what they are doing, and noticing is the whole of it. History offers us illustrations of this, though it offers them less reliably than we usually pretend. We should be honest about that. Much of what we think we know about the inner lives of powerful people from the distant past comes from writers with reasons of their own. The most lurid portraits of the Roman emperors were largely composed decades after the fact, sometimes by men whose families had suffered under them, sometimes by writers serving successors who benefited from their predecessors looking monstrous. The stories are vivid. Vivid is not the same as accurate. So I will not tell you what was going on inside anybody's head 2,000 years ago. Nobody can. But there are things we can point to that are better attested, and they are quieter and more useful. We have, for instance, a set of private notebooks written by a Roman emperor for no audience at all. Marcus Aurelius was not composing philosophy for publication. He was writing to himself, at night, in the field, apparently to keep his own mind in order. And what he keeps returning to is startlingly relevant to everything we have discussed. Reminders not to be changed by the purple. Reminders that he will die like everyone else. Reminders to expect difficult people in the morning and to meet them without contempt. Instructions to himself to consider how things look from where the other person is standing. Notice what that document actually is. It is not evidence of a naturally serene man. Quite the opposite. You do not write down a reminder unless you are afraid of forgetting. The notebooks are a fence, built by a man who understood that his position was working on him continuously, and who decided to work back on it every night. We also have the case of Diocletian, who, after reorganizing an empire, voluntarily gave up the throne and retired to a palace on the coast, becoming, as far as we can tell, a private citizen who grew things. Whatever his motives, the fact itself is remarkable, because it is so nearly unique. In the long catalogue of people who acquired that much authority, the number who put it down while still able to hold it is vanishingly small. And in the founding of one modern republic, A general resigned his commission at the end of a successful war rather than convert military victory into permanent authority, an act that was, at the time, widely regarded across the Atlantic world as astonishing. That reaction is itself the evidence worth noticing. It was astonishing because it was unexpected. It was unexpected because the ordinary course of events runs the other way. That is really all history can tell us here. And it is enough. Not that power inevitably destroys people, it does not. But that stepping back from it is rare enough to be remembered for centuries. And now, slowly, let this turn towards you, because it would be comfortable to keep all of it at a distance, to think of power as something belonging to other people, in other buildings, making decisions about nations and markets and armies. But that is not where most of the power in the world actually lives. Most of it lives in ordinary rooms. It lives in a parent's tone of voice, and in the way a child learns to listen for it long before understanding a single word. It lives in whose day gets rearranged when two plans collide. It lives in who apologizes first, and who is permitted to be tired, and who has to be pleasant about it anyway. It lives in attention, in whether you look up when someone comes in the reply not sent, in the length of the pause before you answer, in the ability to leave somebody waiting and know they will still be there. It lives in withheld warmth, which is one of the oldest instruments there is. The coolness that punishes without a single accusation being made, so that nothing can be named, nothing can be discussed, and nothing can be repaired. It lives in forgiveness, in whether a thing is finally allowed to be over. And it lives most of all in the ability to make another person feel safe, or to make them feel small, using nothing but the way you occupy a room. And it lives, quietly and unglamorously, inside love. There is an old observation about relationships, and it is uncomfortable in the way accurate things often are. In any bond between two people, the one who needs it less has more power. Not because they are cruel or calculating. Often they have no idea. Simply because whoever can more easily tolerate its loss sets the terms of everything that follows. You can watch this happening without anyone intending it. The one who cares slightly less decides where the evening goes, not by insisting, but by having no strong preference. The one who cares more accommodates and calls it flexibility. The one who is more comfortable alone is the one whose moods the household organizes itself around. And this position is not stable. It moves. Across the years of a long relationship, it can pass back and forth between two people several times. Through illness, through work, through who is doing well, through who is frightened this year. Which means most of us have stood on both sides of it, in the same house, with the same person. That is worth remembering when we ask what power does to a mind. Because the mechanisms we have spent tonight describing do not only operate in palaces and boardrooms, they operate at the kitchen table, in miniature, every day, in the ordinary distribution of who has to be careful. The person who is slightly less needed becomes slightly less attentive. The person who is slightly more needed becomes slightly more perceptive. And neither of them chooses it. So let a few questions drift through now. There is no examination here. You do not need to answer them tonight, or ever. Let them arrive and let them go, the way you let a train pass through a station you were not traveling from. Who becomes a little quieter when you walk in? Whose day is shaped by your mood? Who checks your face before deciding how they feel about something? Who is careful with you? And have you ever wondered why? And the last one, which is the one worth sleeping on. What comes out of you when there is no one who can easily say no? Not what you would like to think. What actually emerges on the tired evening, at the end of the difficult week, when you are not being observed by anyone whose opinion you fear. If you are not entirely sure, that is a good answer. It is honest. And honesty is the only place any of this can begin. We are nearly at the end now. The rest is soft. Let the ideas loosen. You do not need to hold them anymore. They will still be there in the morning if you want them, and it will not matter if they are not. Here is what I think, having walked all this way with you tonight. Power is not really the ability to make other people do things. That is only its most visible form, and its least interesting. The deeper thing is this: to hold influence without being possessed by it. To be able to compel, and to choose not to. To be treated as exceptional, and to remain, privately, an ordinary human being who is tired sometimes, and wrong sometimes, and needs other people. To care about someone who has no way of making you care. That last one may be the whole test. Because when a person cannot reward you, cannot harm you, cannot alter your position in any way at all, what you do then is not strategy. There is nothing to be gained from it. It is simply who you are, expressed in a place where no one is watching and nothing is at stake. The world will never require it of you. That is exactly why it counts. Perhaps the final test of power was never what you could make the world do. Perhaps it was only ever this: who you become when the world can no longer stop you. And now let all of that go. You do not have to decide anything about it. Not tonight. Let the thinking slow down. Let the sentences get shorter. Let them come further apart, with more quiet in between. Imagine a crown set down on a table, not thrown, not surrendered, just set down, the way you set down anything heavy at the end of a long day, with that small good feeling of no longer carrying it. It is still there on the table. Nobody has taken it. You are simply not holding it right now. Imagine a guarded room, going still, the watching finished, no one left to assess, no signals to be read, nobody whose approval needs managing, and nobody whose approval you are managing. The door closed, the lamp off. The room simply a room again, and imagine setting down, one at a time, the things you have been carrying today. The conversation you were still rehearsing. Set that down. The reply you were composing in your head. Set that down. The plan that needed one more adjustment. It does not need it tonight. The person you were going to have to handle tomorrow. Tomorrow can have them. The small unfairness you were still turning over. Let it be unfair for a few hours. It will keep. None of it is needed here. The world will arrange itself without your supervision for the next several hours. It has always done this. It is quite good at it. You are allowed to stop steering. Let the shoulders come down. They have probably crept up while we were talking. Let the jaw unclench. Let the hands open. Let the breath out slowly. And let the next one arrive on its own, without you organizing it. There is nothing tonight that requires deciding. There is nothing tonight that requires defending. No ground to hold. No one to convince. Nothing at all that must be controlled in order for you to be safe here, in this bed, in this dark, in this hour. You do not have to be impressive here. You do not have to be right here. You do not have to be anything at all here. No one is deciding about you tonight. No one is waiting on your answer. There is no room turning to look. There is only this: a bed, a dark, a body getting heavier by the minute. Just warm, just heavy, just breathing. The room is quiet. The crown is on the table. The watching is over. And somewhere far away, in a building you will never see, a door is opening, and a room is turning to look. And it has nothing to do with you. Let it go. Sleep well. Sleep into power. Good night, guys.